There is a certain kind of power that our modern world has almost completely forgotten. It is not the power of the loudest voice in the room, or the most compelling argument, or the fastest comeback. It is quieter than any of those things. In fact, it makes no sound at all. It is the power of silence. We live in an era defined by noise. There is always something to say, somewhere to say it, and an audience ready to receive it. Social media has turned every passing thought into a potential broadcast. Offices and homes buzz with constant conversation, notification, and commentary. The average person now consumes more information in a single day than a person living in the 15th century would have encountered in an entire lifetime. We are drowning in words, other people's words, our own words, the constant ambient chatter of a civilization that has mistaken volume for significance and speed for wisdom. And in the middle of all that noise, the idea that choosing not to speak could be a form of strength, that silence could be something you practice deliberately, something you cultivate with the same care and intention that you bring to any other discipline, runs almost entirely against the grain of the world we've built. Silence, in our culture, tends to be read as absence, as passivity, as having nothing to offer. The person who speaks most confidently and most frequently tends to be perceived as the most capable, the most intelligent, the most worth listening to. The Stoics knew better. Stoicism is one of history's most enduring and practically useful schools of thought. Born in ancient Athens around 300 BC and developed over the following centuries by thinkers whose lives were anything but sheltered or comfortable, Stoic philosophy is fundamentally about one thing: the mastery of the self. Not mastery over others, not mastery over circumstances, which the Stoics recognized as being largely beyond our control. The mastery of your own mind, your own reactions, your own inner world in the face of whatever the outer world throws at you. The three figures whose wisdom we will draw on most heavily throughout this video could not have lived more different lives, and that diversity is part of what makes their shared philosophical conclusions so powerful. Marcus Aurelius was a Roman emperor, one of the most powerful men who ever lived, who wrote his private philosophical reflections in a journal he never intended for public eyes. Epictetus was born a slave, spent years of his life as the property of another human being, and emerged from that experience with a clarity about inner freedom that his privileged contemporaries could only aspire to. Seneca was a statesman, playwright, and philosopher who navigated the lethal political waters of Nero's Rome and eventually faced his own death with the equanimity he had spent decades cultivating. What united these three extraordinarily different human beings was a shared understanding of something most of us still struggle to grasp: that the words we choose not to say are often more powerful than the words we do. Zeno of Citium, who founded the Stoic school and whose teachings survive only in fragments, put it simply and memorably: better to trip with the feet than with the tongue. Sit with that for a moment. Think about how many times in your own life that has been true. How many relationships have been fractured by words spoken in a moment of anger that could never be fully taken back? How many opportunities have slipped away because someone spoke before they thought? How many conflicts have been irreversibly escalated by a response that felt absolutely necessary in the moment and revealed itself as catastrophic in retrospect? The feet can recover from a stumble. The damage done by a carelessly or angrily spoken word can echo for years. Stoic philosophy doesn't simply tell us to be quiet. It invites us to develop a relationship with silence that is active, purposeful, and deeply strategic. Silence, in the Stoic tradition, is not the absence of speech. It is the presence of wisdom. It is a deliberate, carefully chosen response, one that can de-escalate conflict, protect your integrity, deepen your understanding of yourself and others, and project a kind of inner confidence that no amount of noise can replicate or undermine. In this video, we are going to explore 9 specific situations where choosing silence is not just the wisest move available to you. It is the most powerful one. 9 distinct moments where the Stoic practice of deliberate quiet has the potential to change the direction of a conversation, a relationship, a reputation, or even a life. As we work through each of these, I want you to think carefully about how these principles might apply to your own experience. Where in your life has speech made things worse? Where might a thoughtful, chosen silence have opened doors that a hasty word slammed shut? Where are you currently pouring energy into noise that would serve you far better as quiet? Let's find out. Number 1. When you are being criticized unfairly. There are few experiences in ordinary life that test our emotional composure quite as thoroughly as unfair criticism. Someone has assessed you, your work, your character, your decisions, your intentions, and they have gotten it wrong. Perhaps carelessly, because they didn't take the time to understand the full picture. Perhaps jealously, because your success or your confidence threatens something in them. Perhaps maliciously, because they have a stake in diminishing you. Whatever the reason, the assessment is unfair, and now you are standing there with that verdict ringing in your ears and every instinct in your body screaming at you to fight back. The impulse to respond immediately and forcefully is almost overwhelming in those moments, and it makes complete sense that it would be. We are wired, evolutionarily, psychologically, socially, to protect our sense of self. We are wired to resist false narratives about who we are, what we're capable of, and what we've done. The desire to set the record straight, to push back against an unfair assessment with evidence and argument, feels not just natural, but urgent and righteous. And yet, the Stoics would ask you to pause before acting on that impulse. Not because the criticism is correct, not because your defense wouldn't be legitimate or justified, but because of a deeper, more important question. What is the response that will actually serve you best? Not just in this moment, but in the long run. Marcus Aurelius, who ruled an empire and faced criticism, conspiracy, and betrayal on a scale that most of us will never experience, returned to this question again and again in the private journals that were eventually published as the Meditations. He wrote, "If something external troubles you, it is not the thing itself causing your pain, it is your judgment about it, and that judgment you have the power to change at any moment." Read that again slowly, because it contains one of the most liberating and practically useful ideas in the history of human thought. The criticism itself, the words, the assessment, the unfair verdict, cannot hurt you. It is just a set of words delivered by a person with incomplete information, personal biases, and their own unresolved fears and frustrations. What has the power to hurt you is your reaction to those words, specifically the meaning you assign to them and the response you allow them to provoke. This realization doesn't minimize the sting of unfair criticism. The Stoics were never naive about the emotional reality of human experience, but it does open up a completely different set of choices. If the criticism doesn't carry inherent power over you, if you are the one deciding whether and how much to grant it, then you suddenly have options that simply don't exist when you're operating from pure instinct and wounded ego. The first option, and the one the Stoics consistently favored, is what we might call the strategic silence. Not the passive, defeated silence of someone who has been beaten into submission and has nothing left to say. Not the tight-lipped silence of someone boiling with unexpressed rage. But the calm, composed, almost serene silence of someone who has looked at the criticism, assessed it honestly, found it wanting, and made the deliberate, conscious choice not to give it more weight than it deserves. Consider what this kind of silence actually communicates to everyone in the room, including the person delivering the criticism. When you respond to an unfair assessment with measured quiet rather than an immediate defensive rebuttal, you signal something profound, that your sense of self is not dependent on this person's opinion of you, that your worth does not require their validation or their agreement, that you are operating from a place of inner security so solid that their words simply cannot reach it. This is extraordinarily disarming. It takes the momentum out of an attack in a way that a counterattack never can, because a counterattack, however justified, confirms that you've been hit. It confirms that the criticism found a target. The calm, unruffled response of someone who clearly hasn't been destabilized by what was said is, paradoxically, a far more powerful refutation of an unfair criticism than any argument you could make. Epictetus, who learned about inner freedom under circumstances of profound external constraint, was emphatic about the relationship between philosophy and behavior. Do not talk about your philosophy, live it. The measured, dignified response to unfair criticism is not a tactic you deploy cynically while seething underneath. It is a form of living your values in real time. It is the embodiment, in a single moment, of everything Stoicism teaches about the relationship between your inner world and the outer world's attempts to disturb it. There is also a genuinely practical, rational step that the Stoics would encourage you to take in the moment of unfair criticism. And this is perhaps the most demanding part of the practice, because it asks something of us that our ego strongly resists. It asks us to examine the criticism honestly, even when it's delivered badly, and look for any kernel of truth it might contain. Marcus Aurelius set a remarkable standard for himself when he wrote, "If anyone can prove to me that I think or act in error, I will gladly change, for I seek the truth by which no one was ever harmed." This is extraordinary. He is saying, I am not interested in protecting my ego. I am interested in being right. And if being right means acknowledging that I was wrong, I will do that without defensiveness or delay. Most of us, when criticized, spend our energy constructing the defense. The Stoic approach asks us first to do something much harder and much more valuable, to genuinely examine whether the criticism, however unfairly delivered, might contain information we need. This kind of honest self-examination requires the calm, non-defensive mental space that only silence can create. You cannot truly hear what someone is saying, even when what they're saying is wrong, if you are already preparing your counter-argument. Here is a practical framework for applying this principle in the real situations of your daily life. When criticism lands, before you do anything else, breathe, not as a cliché, but as a genuine physiological intervention. A slow, deliberate breath, in through the nose, out through the mouth, activates your parasympathetic nervous system, reduces the physical stress response that makes clear thinking so difficult in moments of emotional activation, and creates just enough space between the stimulus and your response for your rational mind to engage. In that breath, practice what the Stoics called cognitive distancing. Remind yourself that this person's assessment of you is their perception, not a fact. It tells you something about them, their expectations, their frustrations, their blind spots, and possibly their intentions. It does not, in itself, tell you anything definitive about you. From that place of separation, do the honest work of examining the criticism objectively. Is there anything genuinely useful in it, buried beneath the unfairness of how it was delivered? If so, extract that usefulness and set the rest aside. Not with resentment, but with the clean, efficient pragmatism of someone who is focused on growth rather than self-protection. If there is nothing useful, if the criticism is purely unfair, possibly even deliberately hurtful, then respond with calm, respectful brevity if a response is truly necessary, or don't respond at all. Let your subsequent actions, the quality of your continued work, and the consistency of your character be your answer. As Marcus Aurelius wrote in a passage that has stayed relevant for nearly 2,000 years, don't waste time arguing about what a good person should be. Be one. There is no more powerful or more lasting refutation of unfair criticism than simply continuing to be, undeniably and consistently, the person the criticism says you're not. Number 2, in the middle of boasts and bragging. Picture this scene, which most of us have encountered in some form. You're at a work event, a social gathering, a dinner party, or a casual conversation, and someone near you is performing their achievements for the room. The recent promotion, the impressive salary, the expensive vacation, the well-connected friends, the series of accomplishments delivered not as genuine sharing, but as competitive display, each one slightly louder and slightly more embellished than the last. The social dynamic in these moments is interesting and worth paying attention to. There is an implicit invitation being extended, a kind of challenge. The person performing their achievements is, consciously or not, inviting the people around them to respond in kind, to establish their own position in the implicit hierarchy being constructed, to play the game. The Stoics would recognize this dynamic immediately, and they would have a very clear recommendation for how to engage with it. Don't play. Not because you have nothing to be proud of, not because your achievements are less impressive than theirs, but because of a much more interesting and much more important insight. The person who feels compelled to broadcast their accomplishments is almost always doing so because they are seeking external validation for a sense of self-worth that isn't yet fully internal. They need the audience's reaction, the impressed nod, the competitive response, the implicit confirmation that they are winning in order to feel what they want to feel about themselves. And here is the Stoic insight that changes everything. You don't need that. Or rather, if you've done the inner work that Stoicism asks of you, you increasingly don't need it. The sense of your own worth, of what you've done, what you're capable of, who you are, is available to you from the inside. It doesn't require the room's applause to exist or to feel real. When you choose not to match bravado with bravado, when you listen with genuine interest rather than barely concealed impatience while you wait to deliver your own highlights, you are demonstrating something that no list of accomplishments can convey. You are demonstrating that you are secure enough in yourself that the performance of success holds no particular appeal for you. And that quality of inner security is unmistakable to perceptive people. It communicates confidence far more effectively than the performance it declines to join. There is a stillness in someone who is genuinely self-assured that is deeply compelling, precisely because it is so rare. It says, without words, I know what I've done and what I'm capable of. I don't need to perform it for you. That stillness is not the absence of confidence, it is its purest and most mature expression. A Stoic saying captures this beautifully in the context of relationships and reciprocity. Rather than responding to one benefit with another, respond with many, but deliver them through the quality of your character and the consistency of your actions, not through words. The person who responds to someone else's boasting not with their own list of achievements, but with genuine curiosity, thoughtful questions, and real attention to the other person. That person leaves a more lasting and more positive impression than any competitor in the Achievement Olympics ever could. There is also a deeper principle at work here that is worth spending some time with, because it speaks to something fundamental about the way we construct our sense of self. Every time you feel the pull to respond to someone else's boasting with your own, it's worth pausing to ask yourself honestly, what is actually driving this impulse? What am I afraid will happen if I don't establish my own credentials in this moment? Usually, if we're honest, the answer involves some version of the fear that we will be seen as lesser, that in the absence of our own performance, the other person's performance will define the hierarchy and we will be at the bottom of it. The Stoics would recognize this fear immediately as what it is: ego operating from insecurity. And their prescription is not to satisfy the ego by performing better, but to gently and persistently examine the fear itself until it loses its grip. The question, what will people think of me if I don't respond, eventually gives way, through practice, to the much more liberating question, why does it matter what they think, given that I know who I am? A life lived in constant comparison to others is, as the Stoics observed with great consistency, an exhausting and ultimately hollow one. The goalposts never stop moving. There is always someone more successful, more wealthy, more impressive by whatever metric you've chosen to compete on. The only comparison that produces genuine satisfaction is the one between who you are and who you are becoming. And that comparison requires turning your attention inward, not outward. So the next time you find yourself in a room full of noise and self-promotion, try the Stoic experiment. Choose the quiet response. Listen more than you speak. Ask genuine questions. Pay attention and notice what happens, not just to the dynamic in the room, but to your own inner experience. Notice whether the absence of competition feels like loss or like relief. Number 3, when you are angry. Anger is one of the most honest emotions in the human repertoire. It signals, often with considerable accuracy, that something has gone wrong, that a boundary has been crossed, that something important has been threatened, damaged, or disrespected. There is nothing inherently wrong with feeling angry. The Stoics never suggested otherwise, and it is important to be clear about this, because Stoicism is sometimes misread as a philosophy of emotional suppression. It is not. What the Stoics were extraordinarily, consistently, and emphatically clear about was the danger of acting from anger before it has been processed, and specifically of speaking from anger, because when we do, we almost invariably make things worse, not just for the situation we're in, but for ourselves, for our relationships, for our reputation, for our own inner peace, which the anger was already disrupting and which an impulsive response tends to disrupt much further. Epictetus addressed this directly. Keep silence for the most part and speak only when you must, and then briefly. Read in context, this is specifically a warning about the kind of speech that happens when the emotional brain has taken over from the rational one, when our vision has narrowed, when our body is flooded with stress hormones, when everything feels urgent and personal and threatening. In that state, the words that come out of us are almost never the words we would choose if we were operating at our best. Marcus Aurelius, whose position as emperor meant that his words in anger could have consequences that most of us will never have to reckon with, returned to this theme with remarkable frequency in his private journals. How much more harmful, he wrote, are the consequences of anger than the circumstances that gave rise to it. This is worth sitting with as a genuine empirical question, not just a philosophical one. Think about the last time you said something significant in anger. Think carefully about the actual damage those words did, to the relationship involved, to your own sense of yourself, to the practical situation you were trying to address. Now think about what gave rise to the anger. In most cases, most honest people will conclude that the original offense was considerably smaller than the damage caused by the response to it. The practical neuroscience here is directly relevant and worth understanding. When we experience strong anger, the amygdala, the part of the brain most associated with threat detection and emotional response, becomes highly active and begins to suppress activity in the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for rational decision-making, long-term thinking, and the regulation of impulsive behavior. This means that the anger literally makes us less capable of the very thing we most need in that moment: clear, careful, consequential thinking. The feeling of clarity that often accompanies intense anger, the sense that you are finally seeing things exactly as they are, is, from a neurological standpoint, almost the opposite of what is actually happening. You are seeing a highly distorted, threat-filtered version of reality. The Stoic prescription, pause, breathe, don't speak, is not just philosophical wisdom. It is, we now understand, physiologically sound advice. The pause gives the stress hormones time to begin metabolizing. The breath activates the calming mechanisms of the parasympathetic nervous system, and the silence creates the space in which your prefrontal cortex can begin to reassert itself. Nelson Mandela's story, which we touched on earlier, deserves extended attention here because it represents perhaps the most extraordinary large-scale example in modern history of Stoic emotional mastery in the face of profound injustice. Mandela spent 27 years imprisoned on Robben Island for his opposition to apartheid, a system of institutionalized racial oppression that violated not just his freedom but his basic human dignity every single day. If anger were ever justified, it was justified for Nelson Mandela. And yet the man who walked out of Victor Verster prison in 1990 had made a decision that most of us, confronted with a fraction of his circumstances, would struggle to make even for an afternoon. He had decided not to let his anger, however legitimate, however righteous, determine his response to what had been done to him and to millions of people who looked like him. He had decided, in the deepest Stoic tradition, that the response he chose would be shaped by his vision of the future he wanted to help build, not by the rage that the past he had endured could easily have generated. The decision to pursue reconciliation rather than retribution did not come from weakness or from forgetting. It came from a clarity forged over 27 years of enforced reflection about what would actually serve justice, what would actually move South Africa forward, what would actually honor the suffering of the people the anti-apartheid movement was fighting for. Anger, Mandela understood, would have been emotionally satisfying and strategically disastrous. Measured, principled, forward-looking action was harder and immeasurably more powerful. When anger rises in you, and it will regularly because you are human and because the world is full of things that deserve to be responded to, give it the respect of acknowledging it honestly. Don't suppress it or deny it or pretend it isn't there, and then give it the discipline of making it wait. Let the silence hold the space while your clearer, calmer, wiser self has the chance to catch up to your nervous system. What you say after that pause will almost always be truer, more effective, and more in line with the person you are trying to be than what you would have said in the heat of the moment. Number 4. In the face of false rumors. There is something uniquely maddening about a false rumor. Unlike a direct accusation, which you can confront head-on with evidence and argument, a rumor operates through implication and whisper. It spreads through a social network the way smoke spreads through a building. Diffuse, atmospheric, impossible to grab hold of. And the harder you try to combat it directly, the more energy and attention you risk feeding into its spread. The instinctive response to a false rumor is immediate, emphatic denial to any and every person who might have heard it through any channel available. The desire to control the narrative, to set the record straight, to make sure that the truth reaches everyone before the lie can take root is completely understandable. It feels like taking action. It feels like defending yourself. But the Stoics would ask you to slow down and think more carefully about what that response actually accomplishes and what it costs. Consider a real-world scenario. A teacher in a small, interconnected community finds herself at the center of a false rumor about professional misconduct. The story is circulating. Colleagues are whispering. Parents are beginning to ask questions. The pressure to respond, to issue a clear public denial, to get ahead of it, to make sure her side of the story is told, becomes intense and persistent. And she makes the deliberate, carefully considered decision to stay quiet. Not to deny the rumor publicly, not to call meetings or issue statements or have the individual conversations that would signal how seriously the accusation has affected her. Instead, she continues to show up every day, teach her students with the same dedication and warmth she always has, and trust that the weight of her actual record will outperform any denial she could offer. This decision is not passivity. It requires more courage and more discipline than the defensive response would. Because the defensive response, however emotionally understandable, carries significant risks that the quiet response does not. Every denial draws attention back to the accusation. Every rebuttal invites a counter-rebuttal. Every public statement about a rumor gives the rumor the kind of oxygen and visibility that silence would have denied it. The person who protests loudly and repeatedly that something isn't true often ends up, paradoxically, keeping the story alive far longer than the person who simply doesn't engage. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not over outside events. Understand this, and you will find strength." The spread of a rumor is, to a very large degree, an outside event. You cannot control who hears it, or who believes it, or how it mutates as it travels. What you can control is your response to it, and specifically, whether your response fuels it or starves it. Epictetus offered a counterintuitive but deeply wise observation about this kind of situation. If someone speaks badly about you, offer them your kindness in return. What this recognizes is that the energy of a rumor is largely fed by the emotional reaction it produces. A calm, warm, undramatic response, or no response at all, removes the fuel. It says, implicitly but powerfully, "This has not destabilized me. There is nothing here worth the drama of a fight." Over time, the teacher's consistent, high-quality presence in her classroom and her community became the only answer the situation required. The rumor, deprived of the fuel that a heated or defensive response would have provided, lost its momentum. The truth, as it tends to do when it is simply lived rather than argued, asserted itself gradually and without fanfare. Number 5. When dealing with loss. Loss is one of the most universal and most unavoidable experiences of human life. The death of someone whose presence shaped your world. The end of a relationship that defined a chapter of your identity. The collapse of a dream you had built carefully over years, a job, a home, a version of your future that has ceased to exist. Whatever specific form it takes, loss leaves a particular kind of silence in its wake, a void that our culture is deeply, almost reflexively uncomfortable with, and that we are conditioned to fill as quickly as possible with activity, distraction, explanation, or noise. The Stoics took a profoundly different view of that silence, not as something to be filled, but as something to be inhabited. Seneca, who across his long and turbulent life experienced exile, the deaths of close friends, and his own eventual death ordered by the emperor he had once served, wrote with extraordinary psychological depth about grief and loss. "The day which we fear as our last," he wrote, "is but the birthday of eternity." This is not a dismissal of grief. Seneca was far too honest and far too sophisticated a thinker for that. It is an invitation, a deeply compassionate one, to hold loss within a larger frame. To understand that what feels like an ending, experienced from inside the acute pain of the immediate, is part of a larger flow that has always included both loss and renewal, ending and beginning. The author and theologian C.S. Lewis, whose honest account of his grief after losing his wife was eventually published as A Grief Observed, captured something similarly Stoic when he reflected that the pain of loss cannot be separated from the love that made the loss possible. You cannot, in other words, grieve deeply without having loved deeply. The grief is not a problem to be solved. It is the evidence of something that mattered. To treat it as an obstacle to be overcome as quickly as possible is to miss what it is actually offering. A reckoning with what is genuinely important and who you genuinely are when everything external has been taken away. What the Stoics recommend in the face of loss is not rushing to fill the silence. It is giving the silence the respect it deserves, allowing yourself the space to feel what you actually feel without the pressure to perform recovery on a timeline that makes other people around you more comfortable. Lewis, in the aftermath of his wife's death, did not rush to public statements or reassurances. He wrote privately, in notebooks he kept for himself alone, exploring the full and often contradictory landscape of his grief without performing it for anyone. He used the silence as a space for genuine self-exploration, not as a void to be plastered over. This is the Stoic practice of reflective silence in the face of loss. It does not mean isolating yourself. The Stoics were consistently clear about the value of genuine human connection in difficult times, about the importance of allowing others to support you when you are suffering. What it means is resisting the cultural pressure to perform recovery, to allow yourself to move through the experience rather than simply past it, to give your grief the honest attention it requires before you let it go. There is a particular kind of wisdom that can only be found in the quiet that follows loss. A clarity about what genuinely matters and what doesn't. A stripping away of the non-essential that leaves you with a much cleaner, much truer sense of your actual values and your actual priorities. This wisdom is not available to those who rush to fill the silence. It belongs specifically to those who have the patience and the courage to remain within it long enough to hear what it has to teach. Number 6. When confronted with ignorance. There is a particular kind of frustration that most of us encounter regularly in both personal and professional life, and that very few people handle with genuine grace. The experience of coming face to face with someone who is confidently, emphatically, and sometimes aggressively wrong. Someone who holds a position with great certainty and energy that the available evidence does not support. Someone who dismisses your perspective without engaging with it seriously, who shows little interest in revising their view regardless of what you present, and whose confidence appears to grow in direct proportion to their distance from the facts. The instinct, for most people, is to correct them, to produce the evidence, to construct the argument, to win the debate. And this instinct is understandable. It comes from a genuine commitment to truth and accuracy. But before acting on it, the Stoics would ask you to consider a more practical question. What are you actually trying to achieve? And is this the approach most likely to get you there? Galileo Galilei's story is one of the most compelling in the history of science precisely because it illustrates, on a grand and consequential scale, what happens when a person possesses genuine knowledge and must navigate a world that is not yet ready to accept it. Galileo had evidence, elegant, rigorous, empirically grounded evidence, that the Earth orbited the Sun. The Catholic Church, the dominant intellectual and political authority of his time, held the opposite position, not on the basis of competing evidence, but on the basis of scriptural authority and centuries of established orthodoxy. Galileo found himself in a position that many of us recognize in smaller everyday forms. He was right. The powerful institution he was dealing with was wrong, and the path of direct, aggressive confrontation carried enormous personal risk while offering limited realistic hope of producing immediate change. He was eventually brought before the Inquisition, forced to formally recant his findings, and spent the final years of his life under house arrest. What is most instructive about Galileo's story, from a Stoic perspective, is not the injustice done to him, though that is real and significant, but the way he responded to it. He continued his work within the constraints imposed on him. He documented his findings with scrupulous care. He maintained his personal integrity. He understood, in a way that is profoundly Stoic in its structure, that the truth he had discovered did not require his martyrdom to survive. The evidence, properly recorded and eventually circulated, would outlast any institution's attempt to suppress it. He focused on what he could control. He accepted, with the equanimity of a philosopher rather than the bitterness of a victim, what he could not. Marcus Aurelius stated it clearly. You have power over your mind, not over outside events. Understand this, and you will find strength. You cannot force another person to update their beliefs. You cannot, through sheer argumentative force, make someone see something they are not yet ready to see, particularly when their resistance to it is emotional and identity-based rather than intellectual. What you can control is how you respond to their ignorance, whether you exhaust yourself in a battle that produces more heat than light, or whether you conserve your energy and your credibility for the work that will, over time, make the point more effectively than any single debate could. The Stoic approach to ignorance is not silence born of defeat. It is silence born of strategic clarity, the recognition that the long game of patient, persistent, high-quality work is almost always more powerful than the short game of winning an argument. Number 7. When rumors are spreading about you. While we explored the dynamics of false rumors in a previous section, the specific situation of rumors spreading in real time within a community you are actively embedded in, your workplace, your neighborhood, your professional network, deserves its own careful attention. Because the temptation to respond is particularly acute when the people hearing the rumor are people whose opinions genuinely affect your daily life and your opportunities. Consider a community environmental advocate, someone who has spent years building a reputation for principled, transparent, effective work, who suddenly finds a rumor circulating that her motives are financial rather than idealistic, that she is using the cause for personal gain. The rumor is false, but it is spreading, and the people hearing it are donors, colleagues, and community members whose trust and support her work depends on. The pressure to get ahead of the story is intense. The instinct to explain, to provide evidence, to have the conversations that would nip the rumor in the bud before it takes root. All of this feels not just reasonable, but necessary. This is the moment where the Stoic practice requires its greatest discipline, because it asks you to trust something that feels counterintuitive, that continuing to simply do your work with the same integrity and dedication you have always brought to it is more powerful than any statement you could issue. Marcus Aurelius. The best response to injury is not to be like the one who performed it. The best refutation of a rumor that says you are not who you claim to be is to continue quietly and consistently being exactly who you claim to be, not in a performed, look-at-me way, just in the ordinary daily way of showing up and doing the work that the rumor says you're not genuinely committed to. Epictetus offered a principle here that is worth committing to memory. If someone speaks badly about you, and it's true, fix yourself. If it's a lie, laugh at it. The laughter Epictetus recommends is not dismissive or defensive. It is the genuine, grounded amusement of someone who knows, with complete inner clarity, the difference between who they actually are and the story being told about them. Someone whose self-knowledge is secure enough that a false story, however widely circulated, simply cannot destabilize it. The practical wisdom here involves several disciplines working in concert. Regulate your emotional response first. The anxiety and anger that rumors produce are understandable, but acting from either of them tends to make things worse rather than better. Get genuinely clear on the facts of the situation before you decide how or whether to respond. If a response is warranted, make it deliberate, measured, and proportionate, not a lengthy, defensive explanation that draws more attention to the accusation, but a brief, clear, confident statement that allows your track record to do most of the work. And then, return your attention to the work itself. Number 8. When confronted with injustice. Of all 9 situations we're exploring in this video, this is perhaps the most philosophically complex, because it asks us to hold together 2 things that appear to be in direct tension. On one hand, a genuine and deep commitment to justice, truth, and moral accountability. On the other, the deliberate, strategic use of silence and restraint as tools of response. How do you practice Stoic quiet in the face of something genuinely wrong without that quiet becoming complicity? The Stoics were absolutely clear on this distinction, and it is important to state it directly. Silence in the face of injustice was never their prescription. What they prescribed was something considerably more nuanced and considerably more powerful. A disciplined, principled restraint that preserved your inner equilibrium, your clarity of judgment, and your capacity for genuinely effective action, rather than a reactive, emotionally driven response that might feel powerful in the moment, but ultimately serves neither you nor the cause you are trying to advance. Epictetus, who had experienced institutionalized injustice from the inside as a slave, offered the deceptively simple maxim, bear and forbear. Not accept injustice as inevitable or just, not do nothing in the face of wrong. but endure what must be endured without losing your inner composure, and bear with the failings of others, including their moral failings, without allowing their wrongdoing to diminish your own integrity or distort your judgment. Nelson Mandela remains, in the modern era, the most powerful embodiment of this principle. 27 years of imprisonment for standing against a system that was not merely unjust, but grotesque in its systematic, institutionalized dehumanization. If the fire of righteous anger was ever fully justified, it was justified for Nelson Mandela. No one would have questioned it. No one would have blamed him. And yet what Mandela built during those 27 years, in the small cell on Robben Island, where he was not permitted to be broken, was something extraordinary. He built a clarity, a vision, a strategic and moral intelligence that had been refined by decades of enforced reflection into something that no amount of comfortable freedom could have produced. He built, in other words, the inner resources that would allow him to emerge from prison not as a man consumed by vengeance, but as a man capable of offering his country something far more rare and far more valuable: the possibility of reconciliation. Mandela's choice was not weakness. It was not forgetting or excusing what had been done. It was the recognition, arrived at through years of the deepest possible Stoic reflection, that the future he wanted to help build required something from him that retribution would have made impossible. The best response to injury, as Marcus Aurelius had written centuries earlier, is not to be like the one who performed it. The Stoic approach to injustice asks us to do the inner work first, to achieve the clarity and the calm that allow us to respond from principle rather than from pain. And then, from that place of hard-won equanimity, to act, to speak, to push for change. Not with the distortion of unprocessed anger coloring every word, but with the moral authority of someone who has chosen their response deliberately and completely. Number 9. When you are being insulted. Epictetus said something about insults that is, on first reading, startling in its implications. If someone succeeds in provoking you, realize that your mind is complicit in the provocation. This is not a comfortable observation. It shifts the locus of responsibility in a way that our first instinct strongly resists. Because when someone insults us, the last thing we want to hear is that we have any role in how much it hurts. We want the problem to be entirely theirs. But Epictetus is pointing at something real and important. An insult is, at its core, a collection of words, a set of sounds or symbols assembled by one person and directed at another. In itself, it has no inherent power. What gives it the power to wound, to destabilize, to provoke, is the receiving mind's response to it. Which means that the question of whether an insult lands is not solely determined by the person delivering it. It is, to a significant and actionable degree, determined by you. This is not a comfortable truth, but it is an extraordinarily liberating one. Because if the power over whether an insult affects you genuinely lies partly with you, then you have agency in those moments that the conventional understanding of insults as things that simply happen to you completely misses. Mahatma Gandhi understood this as well as anyone in the modern era. Throughout his decades-long non-violent campaign for Indian independence, Gandhi faced a level of insult, contempt, and deliberate humiliation that most of us will never experience. Colonial authorities did not merely disagree with him, they actively and systematically worked to mock and undermine his dignity because they understood that his dignity was central to his power and to the power of the movement he led. Gandhi's response was not to meet their contempt with his own. It was not to defend his dignity through aggression or clever rebuttal. It was to remain, with a consistency that was itself a profound philosophical statement, the same person regardless of how he was being treated, the same calm, the same principled clarity, the same genuine warmth toward even those who were actively working against him. He understood, in the deepest Stoic sense, that his dignity was not something that could be stripped from him by external force. It lived in him. It was constituted by his choices, his character, and his values, none of which required anyone else's respect in order to be real. This quality of unshakable inner dignity, the sense that someone simply cannot be reduced to less than they are by what is said about them or to them, is among the most compelling things a human being can embody. It is magnetic in the truest sense. It draws people toward it and simultaneously makes the person who is attempting the insult look small in comparison. The bully who gets the big reaction has achieved something. The bully whose insult lands in a pool of calm and is met with nothing but quiet dignity has achieved nothing, and often knows it. Marcus Aurelius returned to the costs of allowing ourselves to be provoked with characteristic honesty. How much worse are the consequences of our anger and grief than the things that gave rise to them? Apply this as a genuine empirical question to the insults you have responded to in your own life. How much of the damage came from the original insult? How much came from what you did in response to it? The escalation, the retaliation, the words spoken in anger, the relationships damaged in the aftermath. In most honest reckonings, the insult itself did considerably less damage than the response to it. The practical wisdom here is straightforward, though the practice is genuinely demanding. When an insult lands, pause, breathe. Create the space between stimulus and response that the Stoics consistently identified as the location of your actual freedom. From within that space, ask yourself the questions Marcus Aurelius was always asking himself. What is this situation actually requiring of me? What response will serve me best, not just right now, but tomorrow, next week, in the long run? What response reflects the person I am trying to be? And then, and this is the final, crucial step, consider seriously whether any response at all is necessary. Because often, the most powerful and the most self-respecting response to an insult is simply to continue, without drama or defensiveness, being exactly who you are. To let the quality of your character answer the question that the insult raised. To demonstrate, through the simple act of not being destabilized, that the insult never reached the place it was aiming for. We have traveled across these 9 situations through the full range of circumstances in which the Stoic practice of deliberate silence offers something that speech cannot: a deeper power, a more lasting impression, a more authentic expression of who we are at our best. When unfair criticism lands, the calm silence of someone who doesn't require external validation speaks more powerfully than any defense. When others are performing their achievements, the quiet confidence of someone who knows their own worth without the room's applause communicates more impressively than any counter-performance. When anger rises, the pause that creates space for wisdom to speak instead of impulse demonstrates more strength than any explosion. When rumors circulate, the unbroken consistency of a life lived with integrity answers more conclusively than any public statement. When loss empties the world of noise, the willingness to inhabit the silence and hear what it is teaching transforms grief from something purely destructive into something that, over time, deepens and clarifies who you are. When ignorance confronts you, the patient confidence of someone who knows the long game is more powerful than the short game of winning any single argument. When your reputation is under attack, the continued unself-conscious commitment to the work speaks louder than any rebuttal. When injustice demands a response, the clarity and the moral authority that come from responding from a place of equanimity rather than unprocessed pain produce more lasting change than reactive anger ever could. And when someone attempts to reduce you with words, the serene, unruffled quality of someone who simply cannot be reduced is the most powerful response available, more powerful and more dignified than any comeback. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the world, wrote privately and without any intention of being read, "Don't waste time arguing about what a good person should be. Be one." In that quiet instruction, written alone, for no audience, in the small hours of a life lived under enormous pressure, is the entire philosophy of Stoic silence. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, not the silence of defeat or passivity or indifference, the silence of someone who understands with deep and hard-won clarity that the most profound things are spoken not in words, but in the daily, unremarkable, utterly consistent practice of being exactly who you have decided to be. Practice it. Be patient with yourself as you develop it. It is genuinely difficult, and you will fail at it regularly before you begin to get it right. And trust, as the Stoics trusted across 2,000 years of human history, that the world will hear you more clearly and remember you more lastingly when you stop trying so hard to be heard.